Well, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back if I stay away from the microphone? Jim and I, as you have been already told, have been doing these institutes for 20-some years, and we've always had this friendly competition between the two of us in terms of who gets the better rankings from the people who do the feedback at the end of the conference. And I just felt that I was really compelled to share this one with you from the last institute we did down in North Carolina. This particular lady not only gave me all high fives, but she wrote at the bottom, if I had only 20 minutes to live, I'd want to spend it listening to Bill Bennington. And then when I turned the page over, that's what she had written on the back of the page. So this could be a very long morning here. And speaking to the point about Jim and I being the most intelligent people in the world, I'd like to share another little story with you here just to start that will kind of put things into perspective in terms both of where I'm coming from and my relative abilities. Segue back to Easter time, just prior to Easter, and I happen to have two great-granddaughters, one who is 5 and one who is 3, who came down to visit us along with my son, their grandfather, and his wife. And they refer to my son as Poppy, and so they refer to me as Poppy's daddy. And the ladies were all sitting around talking about Easter dresses, and I didn't have a gig that day, so I said, why don't I take Fiona to get her an Easter dress? And the ladies had a discussion about it for a while and finally said, okay. So then I got my instructions, and I live over in New Jersey. So the instructions were go to Nordstrom's, King of Prussia Mall, go to this department. They gave me specific directions on where to go. So Fiona and I get in the car and we're driving over there, and she says, Poppy's daddy, why aren't you at work today? Now, rather than get into institutes for nonprofit excellence and consulting and all of those kinds of things, I just made it very simple. I said, well, sweetie, I'm retired and I don't have to go to work if I don't want to. So then there were 100 other questions along the way. We get to King of Prussia, we find this wonderful sales lady. We pick out a couple of dresses. The sales lady takes Fiona back in the changing room, puts a dress on her, brings her out, and as she's walking up to me, says to Fiona, what do you think your grandfather's going to say about this dress? And Fiona looks up at her and says, oh, he's not my grandfather. He's my Poppy's daddy, and he's retarded. He doesn't have a job. So now it's all, we've level set the field here. Now what's going on? There we go. So we're going to talk about strategic planning this morning, and I'd like to just make one point right up front. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do strategic planning. Show me a kid that wants a bicycle, and I'll show you somebody that can do strategic planning. And we'll talk some more about this later on. And this particular point here is one we hear an awful lot from nonprofits. We just have so many problems to cope with. We can't take the time to plan, and my theory is probably if you can't take the time to plan, that's why you have so many problems. And there are a number of things we can cite in terms of people who talked about planning, and Dwight Eisenhower was, I believe, considered the most, I don't know the word I want to use here, my mind just went blank, capable, the most proficient strategic planner of the last century. And that first point up there, what he was driving at is that it's not so much what goes on paper when you do planning, it's what goes across the table between people that are engaged in the organization that really creates the change. Because as any of you know that have been in the military, once the battle starts, you pretty much throw the plans out anyway and then start replanning along the way. And I've done one-on-one consulting with more than 450 nonprofit organizations, helping them do plans, and I found that to be really true, that it's the dynamics across the table that really make the difference in terms of organizational change as you move forward. And then, of course, I always like to point to this one. Planning is telling your dollars where to go so you don't have to wonder where they went. One day I pointed to this in a presentation like this. The lady raised her hand and says, well, that sounds a little bit conceited to me. And I said, well, the definition of conceit is a false love for oneself, and in my case, it's a real thing. So. And then the Bible also has some things to say about planning. I'm sure many of you know these. And they're in your, incidentally, if you haven't already figured it out, the presentations are in the binder so you can pretty much follow along. And I typically, as I present, I talk about things that I think are important, and sometimes I'll skip other things on the slide that may be important to you, but in the interest of time, I just don't feel like reading every word on a slide to everybody. This one doesn't really, if you know your Bible really well, in Acts chapter 19, verse 32, you'll know it doesn't have a darn thing to do with planning, but it certainly makes the point that if you don't have a plan, there's a certain dynamic that might take place in your organization. A couple of words about, in a real world experience, about how planning can, or failure to plan can lead to problems. I worked in North Carolina for 10 years up to 2003 with Blue Cross and Blue Shield in North Carolina, and commuted from Philadelphia down there every week. And during that time down there, I was asked at one point to be the keynote speaker for a Habitat for Humanity regional conference in Roanoke, Virginia. And so in getting ready to head over to Roanoke, I walked up to one of the ladies that worked for me in the hall and said, what's the best way to get to Roanoke? And she said, well, take 40 west, 77 north, hit 81, and it'll get you to Roanoke. Then a little bit later, got to thinking, well, I wonder how long it's going to take. And I went to another lady that worked for me, and I said, how long does it take to get to Roanoke? She said 2.5 hours. Now, I'm one of these people, I don't like to be late for anything. So I figured I'd give myself 4 hours. So I get on the road, and I start driving across 40, and that's about an hour and a half right there. And I'm going up here, and I'm getting up toward the state line. I'm starting to look at my watch and say, you know, I don't think this is right. And so I get to the state line. Now, mind you that I had a map, but the map was in the trunk of my car. So I stop the car, and I get the map out. And I'm looking at the map, and I see something up here that says, and I'm like right here on the map, and it says Blue Ridge Parkway. Now, I don't know if anybody in the room or all of you know what the Blue Ridge Parkway is, but the Blue Ridge Parkway is probably the most beautiful road in the world. It goes over the top of the mountains in North Carolina. I didn't know it at the time, so I get on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and I'm tooling along in my brand new leased Honda Accord. There's not another car on the road. And there's these beautiful sweeping curves and these gorgeous vistas, and I'm looking, and I've got music playing on my satellite radio, and I'm driving along about 65 miles an hour, and I pass a sign that says speed limit on the parkway 45 miles an hour. I said, well, there's nobody around, so I didn't slow down. And this is what the parkway looks like, incidentally, as it winds through the mountains. I passed through a town called Mayberry, believe it or not. There is a Mayberry. For those of you that used to watch, what was the name of that show? Andy Griffith. So I'm going through the town of Mayberry like wildfire, and all of a sudden I look in my rearview mirror and I see these flashing blue lights. And now I say to myself, I'm really in trouble. So I pull over, and the cop pulls up behind me, and out of the police car, and I'm not joking, steps a Dave Phillips size, 6'6" I don't know how tall you are, Dave, but that's probably pretty close, version of Don Knotts with his hand on his pistol, and he walks over like this to the car. I can see all this in my rearview mirror, and I'm thinking, I'm going to jail. This guy's going to arrest me. So I roll down my window, and he looks in like, you know how they look in like this? And he says to me, I've been waiting all day on you. And I said, well, I got here as quick as I could. Big mouth, and then I knew I was going to jail. And he looked at me for a couple minutes, and he walked back, and he got in the cruiser and drove away. Never said another word to me. So I got the map out again, and I looked, and I figured a little bit up the way there was a way to get back over to 81. Long story short, I was 6 minutes late getting to the Baptist church where they were doing this conference. 700 people sitting there waiting for me. I was frantic. No cell phone service up in the mountains. I couldn't call them. I didn't have a number to call somebody anyway at the church. I was frantic. They were frantic. Their keynote speaker hadn't shown up. And all I would have had to do in terms of planning was go on MapQuest and spend 2 minutes, and I would have known. Now, the woman that said 2.5 hours goes to Roanoke from here to there through the mountains. The other woman doesn't like to drive in the mountains, who said take the long route around. And just by virtue of a little planning, I could have saved myself just a ton of trouble and everything else.